I never thought I would stand on top of the old concrete dam, both of my hands gripping the rusted wheel as cold rain soaked through my clothes. Below me, the brand new neighborhood sparkled with fresh paint and bright streetlights, a place I never agreed to, a place built on my land without my permission. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The HOA president, Mr. Granger, was down there holding his umbrella like he owned everything he could see. Rows of 109 homes stretched across what used to be my quiet valley, a place that belonged to my family for generations. And right behind those houses was the one thing they never bothered to ask about: the dam. My dam. The one thing keeping millions of gallons of water from rushing into the valley. As the wheel turned, making a deep groaning sound, the first stream of water slithered out like a snake waking up. Then it happened. A roaring wave burst through the opening, exploding outward like a giant beast. Water rushed forward, swallowing the neat green lawns and the shiny sidewalks. Cars bobbed like toys thrown in a bathtub. People screamed. Lights flickered. The HOA officers dropped clipboards and ran in circles like ants during a storm. And then, before the biggest surge fell, I saw Mr. Granger look up at me. His eyes were full of shock. And fear. And something else. Something I still don't understand. I didn't smile. I didn't shout. I didn't hide. I just watched the water rush, carrying away the homes they built without my permission. But just as the largest wave curled forward and the whole valley shook beneath me, a hand grabbed my shoulder. And that's where everything changed. Cliffhanger: what happens next begins in Chapter 2. Only when you say so. Now, let me take you back to where this story really began. Before the water. Before the anger. Before the lost kindness that I had to learn again, the hard way. It all started on a quiet morning on my land. I'm a simple person. My name is Thomas, but most people in town just called me Old Tom, even though I'm not that old. My land stretched across a peaceful valley with tall grass, calm breezes, and little streams that whispered at night. I didn't build the dam for power or anything fancy. I built it to protect the lower part of my land from flooding during storms. For years, it was just me, my dog Willow, and the quiet world around us. But that peace changed the day I saw strange, colorful flags poked into my soil. Little squares of orange, blue, and red cloth stood everywhere along the hillside, waving like tiny invaders. I didn't understand it at first. I thought maybe the town workers were doing some inspection. But when I walked deeper into the valley, I saw trucks. Big ones. Loud ones. Carrying steel beams and wooden planks. Then I saw men wearing bright vests and hard hats. And right in the middle of them was a tall sign. Future site of Hawks Ridge Community, 109 luxury homes coming soon. Managed by the Hawks Ridge HOA. I blinked at the sign, thinking my eyes were tricking me. Luxury homes? On my land? I didn't sell anything. I didn't sign anything. I didn't agree to anything. "Excuse me," I said to the first worker I saw. "What's all this?" He shrugged casually. "Ask the HOA. They approved everything. But this land is mine." He laughed like I told the funniest joke ever. "Well, talk to the HOA. I'm just doing my job." That was the beginning of the first trouble, the small trouble, the less extreme kind. The kind that annoys you, but doesn't break you. I walked all the way to town that afternoon, the sun beating down on my back, Willow panting at my side. I wanted answers, real answers, not the nonsense the worker gave me. At the HOA office, I met the famous Mr. Granger. His office smelled like lemon polish and old carpet. He smiled the entire time I spoke, which made me even more nervous. "Mr. Granger," I said slowly, "you built on my land." He tapped a stack of papers. "We have full approval." I shook my head. "Approval from who?" "From the community board," he replied. "But I own the land. Why wasn't I part of this board?" "That's not our concern," he said coolly. Then he slid a paper across the desk. "According to this map, the land belongs to Hawks Ridge HOA. I stared at that piece of paper. My name wasn't on it. My boundaries weren't on it. It was all wrong. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt something heavy in my chest, like someone pressing a cold stone against my heart. I walked out without shouting, without cursing, without anger, but the quiet inside me wasn't peace. It was confusion and sadness. The lowest low of that week came the next day. I returned home to find bulldozers ripping through a patch of trees I planted with my father when I was a boy. Trees that meant something. Trees we watered together. I stood there, my fists shaking, but I still didn't become angry. Not yet. Instead, I tried kindness. I brought lemonade to the workers the next morning. I spoke softly. I asked calmly. I hoped someone, anyone, would listen. One worker did. A young man with kind eyes. He told me quietly that the HOA had misfiled paperwork, taken advantage of my quiet nature, and assumed I wouldn't fight back. They think you're weak, he whispered. They think you won't do anything. That hurt. It hurt deeper than anything else so far. Because I wasn't weak, I was patient. But patience can turn into something dangerous when pushed too far. Still, I chose empathy first. I chose the path of peace. I didn't want a war. I tried to talk to the HOA again. They ignored me. I mailed letters. They sent them back unopened. I called City Hall. They put me on hold until the line died. And every day, more houses went up. 20, then 40, then 70, then more, until the valley didn't look like my home anymore. Then came the next small but painful moment, the day Willow went missing because of all the noise and strangers. I found her hours later, shaking under a trailer. That night I cried. Not because I lost her, but because I almost did because of them. Kindness wasn't working. Empathy wasn't working. So quietly you could hear the grass grow. I decided to watch them. I studied their patterns, their routines, their mistakes, and that's when I realized something they didn't. They built the houses in the lowest part of the valley, right beneath the dam. My dam. The one they didn't know existed. Or the one they thought didn't matter. That's when the idea formed. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. But out of something different. Something cuter. Something older. But before I could even begin to think through my plan, something extreme happened. Something that changed everything and pushed me closer to the moment you saw at the start of this chapter. It was midnight. I heard shouting outside my cabin. Bright lights. Running footsteps. Police knocking on my door with their flashlights shaking. And then, one officer stepped forward and said, "Sir, the HOA has filed a complaint. They claim you're trespassing on their land. We need you to come with us." That was the extreme event that ended everything peaceful. "Where are you watching from?" The flashlight beams bounced off the trees, making long, shaky shadows that stretched across my cabin walls. Willow barked and hid behind my legs as the officers stepped closer. My heart thumped hard, but I kept my voice calm because losing my cool wouldn't help anything now. "Officers," I said softly, "this is my home." They looked at each other like kids caught in a lie. One of them, the youngest, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, the HOA filed a trespassing claim. They said you're refusing to leave their property." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable that anyone could say something so wrong with a straight face. "This land has been in my family longer than any HOA has existed," I said, "and I can prove it." The older officer crossed his arms. "You can explain that downtown." That moment felt like someone pushed me off a cliff. I wasn't angry. I wasn't scared. I was tired, deep tired. Tired of being peaceful. Tired of trying to be kind. Tired of being ignored like some small tree in the shadows. But I didn't argue. Arguing would only make things worse. I held up my hands slowly to show I wouldn't fight, and they led me to their car. Willow howled as the door closed, her paws scratching the ground in panic. My heart twisted watching her. She didn't understand any of this. She just knew her world was falling apart. The drive to the station was quiet. Too quiet. The officers didn't say a word, but I could feel the guilt sitting heavy on them like wet clothes. Maybe they knew this didn't feel right. Maybe they didn't care. I couldn't tell. At the station, they put me in a small room with a flickering light and a broken chair. I sat down and waited, staring at the wall. I tried thinking about peaceful things, sunrise over the valley, Willow running through tall grass, my father teaching me how to fix the dam when I was a kid. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. After almost an hour, Mr. Granger walked in. He had the same smug smile he wore the first day we met. His suit looked too new, too shiny, like he wanted everyone to see how important he thought he was. "Tom," he said, pretending to be friendly, "you're making this harder than it needs to be." I looked up slowly. "Give me my land back." "It's not your land," he replied. "Not anymore. We have paperwork." "Paperwork you forged." He blinked too fast. A tiny sign of fear. Or guilt. Or both. But he recovered quickly. "No one will believe that," he said. "We built a whole community now. 109 homes. Families. Kids. People who trust us. Not you." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You can't win, Tom, so stop trying." Something sharp sparked inside me then. Not rage. Not revenge. Something clearer. A cold kind of understanding. He thought he had already won. He thought I was too quiet to fight back. He thought he had all the power. And that is when I realized the truth. The dam wasn't just holding back water anymore. It was holding back the part of me I had buried for too long. He left the room without waiting for an answer. Minutes later, an officer returned and told me I was free to go, as long as I didn't make trouble. I walked home in the dark, the night air cold on my skin. Willow ran to me the second she saw me, whining and circling my legs. I knelt and hugged her tight, whispering, "I'm here. I'm not leaving." Everything around me felt heavier. The trees, the house, the whole valley seemed to be watching, waiting for what I would do next. The next morning, I woke up early and packed a small bag with tools, gloves, and my father's old flashlight. I walked up the hill toward the dam, Willow trotting beside me. The air smelled like rain, and the sky growled with distant thunder. When I reached the top, I looked down at the neighborhood below. The rows of houses stood neat and shiny, like soldiers prepared for a battle they didn't know was coming. Children played in yards that used to be wild open fields. HOA officers strolled between houses, clipboards in hand, acting like kings of their tiny world. And right there, watching them, I felt something strange, something warm. I remembered the lessons my mother taught me when I was young. Kindness is strength. Forgiveness is wisdom. But kindness doesn't mean being walked on. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting people steal your life. As I stood there, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping on the dam like impatient fingers. That's when I noticed something odd. Down below, a group of HOA officers were gathered around a pickup truck. They were holding something. Something big. Something that made my stomach drop. As I squinted through the rain, trying to understand what it was, a loud crack split the air. Not thunder, wood. A giant construction beam fell from one of the unfinished houses, crashing onto the street and sending workers running. The beam hit the street with a deafening crash, sending dust and splinters into the cold morning air. Workers screamed, leaping out of the way, while cars honked and tires spun on the wet asphalt. I could hear the faint whimper of a child somewhere in the distance. My heart skipped a beat, and Willow growled low in her throat, fur standing on end. I stayed hidden behind the dam's concrete wall, watching every movement. I didn't move yet. I didn't shout. I needed to understand what was happening. The HOA had built these homes recklessly. They didn't care about safety or the people below, or even the law. This accident was proof of that. Through the rain, I could see Mr. Granger sprinting toward the chaos, face pale. His umbrella had been abandoned, and he waved his arms, trying to control the panic. "Get everyone back! Stay calm!" he shouted, but no one listened. The fear was already rolling through them like a second wave. The small crowd of workers scrambled to lift the beam, calling for help. One man, red-faced and shouting, cursed the HOA and their perfect plans as he tugged on ropes, but the beam was stuck. The rain slicked the street, making every movement dangerous. People slipped and grabbed at each other, some falling hard. I could see the raw fear in their eyes, the kind you only feel when you know your life could end in a single second. I stayed crouched, watching. My hand touched the cool metal of the dam's wheel. The water was waiting. It didn't move yet, but it was ready. Ready to remind them of what they had ignored for years, that nature and patience are far stronger than arrogance. Then, I noticed something else. One of the houses closest to the dam had its foundation weakened by heavy machinery and constant digging. Rainwater was pooling around it, seeping into cracks. It wasn't enough to fall yet, but it would be soon. Just a few more minutes, and gravity alone could do what paperwork never could. I could feel the adrenaline rising. But I breathed deeply. I reminded myself that the lesson wasn't just about revenge. It was about balance. They needed to see the consequences of ignoring kindness and respect. They needed to see what happens when greed outweighs empathy. The child whimpering earlier had been quiet for a few moments. I strained my eyes, trying to locate her. She was standing next to a woman I assumed was her mother, near one of the parked trucks. The mother waved frantically at another worker to get away from the beam. My chest twisted. I didn't want anyone to be hurt. I turned my gaze back to the workers struggling with the beam. Sparks flew as metal scraped against concrete. One worker slipped and fell hard, smashing his elbow against the pavement. He groaned, but scrambled up again. Another slipped after him. Chaos was everywhere. And then it happened. A loud crack echoed through the valley. Not thunder, not the beam, but the dam itself. A small section of concrete shifted. I froze, my hand gripping the wheel tighter. Willow barked sharply. I could feel the vibration under my feet. The dam, my dam, was holding back more than just water. It was holding back the moment I had been waiting for. The section cracked wider, and water trickled out in a thin, teasing stream. I looked down at the homes below. The water glinted in the weak sunlight breaking through clouds, making it look almost alive. I could feel the tension rising like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter. I knew I had to make a choice. If I turned the wheel all the way, the flood would sweep down, washing away their mistakes. But I also knew it would put innocent people in danger. My mind raced. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I wanted to teach a lesson. A lesson about respect, patience, and empathy. Not a lesson in destruction for the sake of anger. Then I heard Mr. Granger's voice, sharp and commanding, from below. He was yelling at the workers, but he also spotted me. His eyes widened when he saw my hand on the wheel. Panic flashed across his face. The way he looked like he had finally realized that the rules they had been hiding behind weren't stronger than reality sent a chill down my spine. The water started flowing a little faster through the crack. Small streams snaked down the valley, hitting the grass and sending tiny waves toward the first houses. The workers screamed, trying to grab sandbags and anything to stop it. I could see the fear in their eyes. For the first time, they weren't laughing at me. And then, one of the workers, a young man I had seen helping me months ago when I brought lemonade, looked up at me, his eyes wide with recognition. I nodded slightly, acknowledging him. He understood. He understood the patience, the quiet watchfulness, the choice to wait until the lesson could be taught clearly. And just as the water began to hit the edge of the first yard, a bolt of lightning split the sky. The thunder followed almost instantly, echoing like the roar of the valley itself. It was a warning. A reminder that nature is alive and unpredictable. And in that moment, the rain fell harder, the wind picked up, and the beam from earlier finally gave way, sliding into the street with a heavy crash, narrowly missing the mother and child. Screams filled the air, people ran in every direction, cars skidded, and Willow barked ferociously, standing protectively by my side. I stood frozen, hands still on the wheel. I hadn't even turned it yet. The flood was coming on its own, but I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. This was only the beginning. The rain poured harder now, soaking me to the bone. Willow's fur was slick and dripping, but she didn't move away from my side. The valley had become a chaotic blur of movement and noise. Cars skidded in the mud, tires spinning helplessly. People shouted, screaming orders that no one could follow. The beam that had fallen earlier now blocked part of the road, forcing everyone to scramble around it. I could see Mr. Granger running toward the site, umbrella long abandoned, his suit plastered to his body. I stayed on top of the dam, gripping the wheel, my knuckles white. The small stream of water that had been leaking through the cracked section had grown stronger. The current was picking up. I could feel the vibration through the concrete, almost like the dam was speaking to me, warning me that it wouldn't hold for long. I thought back to my father, long gone now, showing me how to maintain the dam when I was a child. He had always told me, "Tom, water is patient, but it always finds a way." Those words echoed in my mind. Water didn't rush. Water didn't fight. It moved deliberately, relentlessly, until it reached what it was meant to. And now, it was ready. Down below, the first row of houses trembled. The yard closest to the crack was already flooded, water creeping up the driveways and around the flower beds. Children screamed, and parents shouted at them to get inside. Cars parked in the streets were now half submerged. The HOA officers were yelling at the workers to stop it, but there was nothing anyone could do. The flood had a mind of its own, and it was moving fast. I didn't smile. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. This wasn't about revenge. This was about respect, about patience, about teaching a lesson that no paperwork or board meeting could ever convey. I could see fear and chaos in their eyes the same way I had seen them ignore my pleas, my letters, my calls. The tables had turned, and for the first time, they understood what it felt like to be powerless. The young worker who had helped me months ago looked up again. I gave him a slight nod. He hesitated, then ran to warn the families closest to the water. I could see him shouting at a mother to take her child inside and at a man to move his car. His bravery made my heart swell. Even in the midst of chaos, kindness could still shine through. But then something worse happened. One of the houses near the middle of the development began to collapse. The foundation had been poorly built, and the water rushing around it had weakened the supports. A loud crack reverberated through the valley, followed by a deafening crash as the house toppled to the side. Splinters flew through the air like deadly rain. People screamed and scrambled to safety. I could see a man frozen in shock as the structure fell mere feet from him. I clenched the wheel tighter. The water had reached full force now, spilling in thick, muddy waves across the streets. It wasn't just the first row of houses anymore. The flood was moving quickly toward the second row. Sidewalks disappeared beneath the brown torrent. Lawns, gardens, and playgrounds were swept away like paper. The HOA officers ran in every direction, shouting, panicked, and lost. The chaos was extreme, beyond anything I had imagined. Through the rain, I spotted Mr. Granger again. He had slipped on the mud and fallen hard, scraping his hands and knees. His umbrella had flown into the flood. I could see the fear in his eyes, pure, unmasked fear. He wasn't a king anymore. He wasn't in control. He was just a man, like the rest of them, facing something far bigger than himself. And yet, in the middle of this storm, I saw glimpses of humanity. People were helping one another. Neighbors were shouting directions to keep children safe. Workers who had been ignoring my land for months were now risking their own safety to save someone else. Even in the worst moments, kindness fought to survive. It was messy, chaotic, but real. I felt the urge to act. I turned the wheels slightly, releasing more water from the dam. Not enough to destroy everything, just enough to make sure the lesson landed. The stream grew faster, stronger, heading toward the flooded streets. People screamed again, but this time I saw some begin to move with urgency, pulling each other to safety. The flood was teaching them, not destroying them. Lightning flashed, and the sky split with a roar of thunder. The wind howled through the trees, bending them like paper. I could see one of the unfinished houses on the far edge of the development starting to tilt. Its frame creaked and groaned as the storm pushed against it. A strong gust sent part of the roof sliding toward the ground. I froze, watching as the extreme event unfolded. The water, the collapsing structures, the wind, it all converged into one unstoppable force. And I knew, deep down, that the next moment could change everything again. The wind screamed through the valley like a living thing, whipping rain into sheets that stung my face. Willow pressed close to my leg, shivering but alert. The dam beneath me groaned and shuddered as more water rushed through the crack, carrying the muddy brown flood toward the rows of homes. I could hear the distant shouts of the remaining workers and residents, but their voices were swallowed by the storm and the relentless roar of the water. The house that had begun tilting yesterday was now sliding dangerously. Its frame creaked, bent under the pressure of gravity and the mud-soaked ground. I watched as one of the upper beams snapped, sending a cloud of dust and splinters into the air. People scattered in every direction, barely escaping the debris. I felt my chest tighten. This was far beyond the small trouble of misplaced flags or ignored letters. This was survival. And yet, even in this chaos, small moments of courage appeared. The young worker who had helped me before was now helping an elderly couple navigate a flooded street. He held the woman's hand firmly while the man clutched the arm of another worker. I could see the fear in their eyes, but also trust. They knew he was their lifeline, and he didn't let them down. That courage gave me hope that kindness, even in disaster, could survive. I turned the wheels slightly again, letting the water flow a little faster. My mind was clear. I wasn't angry, not really. I wasn't acting out of revenge. I was teaching them a lesson they had ignored for years. That land, patience, and respect aren't things to be taken lightly. They can't be erased by a signature or a board decision. They are lived, protected, and cared for. Below me, the floodwaters surged. The streets disappeared beneath the thick, churning mud. Cars were swept along like toys. Fences toppled, and small sheds that had been carelessly built collapsed into the torrent. The HOA officers ran from street to street, shouting, trying to regain control, but there was no control left. Nature had taken over, and I had opened the door just enough to remind them of it. I looked at Mr. Granger again. He had found his footing and was now shouting at workers to get people out of the water. His suit was ruined, his hair plastered to his head. For the first time, he didn't look like the confident, untouchable man who had ignored my letters. He looked human, vulnerable, afraid. I wondered if he would ever understand why this had happened, or if the lesson would just pass through him like a storm he would soon forget. And then the next small but dangerous event occurred. The heavy rain had loosened a hill above the far end of the neighborhood. Rocks and mud began tumbling down, adding more chaos to an already catastrophic scene. A boulder the size of a small car crashed onto the road, bouncing and sliding toward a parked van. The van's doors were open, and a family inside screamed, scrambling for higher ground. I could see the mother grab her child and leap towards safety just in time. I knew the extreme moment was coming. The water was gathering speed and mass, racing across streets and lawns. A section of the second row of homes, poorly built and undermined by the rain, began to tilt toward the flood. The wood groaned and snapped. People yelled and ran, but it was too late for some of the structures. Windows shattered as walls began to buckle. The floodwaters hit, and debris was carried forward like driftwood. The young worker I had noticed earlier shouted to help a small boy caught in the torrent. I could see him reach through the current, grasping the child, holding on with all his strength. My heart raced. I wanted to help, but I knew my role now was to guide, not to interfere. Nature and patience were teaching the lesson. Fear, courage, and chaos were showing them the cost of ignoring what is right. And then it happened. The extreme event that shook the valley to its core. A loud, terrifying crack rang out as the foundation of another house gave way entirely. The house slid sideways into the rushing water, toppling like a toy in a bathtub. The debris struck cars, fences, and smaller structures, carrying them downstream. People screamed and scrambled. Willow barked and lunged forward, as if to warn me, protect me, and yet urge me to act with care. The flood was now a full force of nature, and the valley had become a living lesson. I stayed at the dam, holding the wheel, my hands slick with rain and mud, and I realized that even though destruction was happening, small acts of bravery and kindness were still alive. The storm had revealed both the worst and the best in people. And then, just as I thought the chaos had reached its peak, a huge flash of lightning struck the top of the dam, sending a shiver through the concrete and a blinding light into my eyes. I froze, heart pounding, knowing this was not over. The lightning strike had set my nerves on fire. The flash was blinding, and the thunder that followed shook the valley, like it might split the earth in two. Willow pressed herself closer to my side, growling low in her throat. The dam shuddered beneath my feet, a deep, threatening groan rolling up from the concrete. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the cold metal bite into my palms, reminding me that patience and preparation were one thing, but nature always demanded respect. Below me, the floodwaters had grown into a thick, violent torrent. Streets had disappeared, lawns were submerged, and debris floated past like giant brown logs. The first rows of homes had already been destroyed, their ruins scattered along the rushing current. Some cars were nearly invisible beneath the water, their occupants screaming and climbing to anything that would keep them above the surface. The chaos was terrifying, but in the middle of it, there were sparks of courage. Neighbors were helping neighbors. People were pulling each other to higher ground, showing a strength and kindness that surprised me. I had made my choice long ago. I had decided to release just enough water to teach them the lesson, not to harm the innocent. But the storm, the rain, the instability of the houses, they were forces beyond my control. I had warned them with letters, phone calls, even attempts at conversation, but they ignored me. This was the consequence. The first smaller extreme event of the morning had passed the falling boulder from the hill, but the second was now forming. One of the mid-valley houses, still under construction, had its scaffolding collapse. Planks of wood and metal poles crashed into the floodwaters, spinning and twisting with the current. Workers shouted, but the roar of the water and wind made it impossible to hear. The young man I had noticed earlier ran toward the site, helping a worker who had tripped. He dragged him to safety just as another beam came loose, striking where he had been standing moments before. I felt a cold satisfaction, not from anger, but from the clarity that my warnings had been ignored. This was their moment to understand that respect and patience matter more than plans and profit. Mr. Granger appeared again, soaked and frantic. He was trying to organize the residents, but it was chaos. His confident demeanor had completely vanished. I could see the fear in his eyes now, the same look people get when they realize they are powerless against forces far beyond their control. He shouted orders that no one could follow. The flood had claimed control. And then the extreme event came, fully alive and undeniable. One of the houses in the far row, still nearly complete, suddenly began to tilt. Its foundation had been undermined by water, and the walls creaked and groaned as though the house itself were screaming. A strong gust of wind pushed it further, and with a terrifying crash, the entire structure collapsed into the flood below. Splinters flew like arrows, and debris carried by the current struck cars, fences, and smaller structures. The water churned with destruction, and the screams of those witnessing it rose above the storm. I didn't move yet. I didn't intervene. This was nature, yes, but it was also the consequence of neglect, arrogance, and ignoring warnings. The chaos showed me the duality of humanity, the careless arrogance of some and the courage of others. The young worker continued to rescue people from the current, leading them to higher ground. I realized then that even in disasters, empathy could survive. It could thrive. It could shine even in the darkest moments. And then came another smaller but tense moment. I noticed the storm had loosened another section of the hill above the upper dam. Rainwater had created a mudslide that was creeping downward, threatening the trees that had stood for decades. I could see the roots straining against the mud. If the trees gave way, they would fall toward the lower homes, adding more danger to the already catastrophic scene. I glanced at the wheel. The water through the crack had grown stronger, faster, but it wasn't uncontrollable. I could still guide it. I could still release a controlled surge to redirect the worst of the flow away from the few families still trapped. My father's voice echoed in my mind. Water is patient, Tom, but it always finds a way. I understood him now more than ever. The storm's intensity rose again. Lightning flashed across the valley, thunder ripping through the sky. The trees above the upper dam swayed violently, and the mudslide began moving faster. Houses below shuddered with each wave, and one of the mid-valley streets started to split under the pressure of the rushing water. Then it happened, the extreme event that ended the chapter. A partially constructed home in the middle of the second row finally gave way completely. It toppled sideways, crashing into the water with a thunderous roar. Debris flew in all directions, smashing into nearby houses and vehicles. People screamed, ran, and clung to anything solid. The floodwaters surged even higher, brown and unstoppable, carrying everything in their path. I held the wheel, gripping it tightly, and realized that what had started as a small crack was now a full-scale force of nature. The lesson was in motion, unstoppable, and the valley had become a testament to the consequences of arrogance and the resilience of courage. The valley had transformed into a whirlwind of chaos. The floodwater roared past homes, vehicles, and fences, tearing apart everything that had been built without care. Willow stayed glued to my side, her fur slick with rain, growling and barking at anything that moved too close to me. I stood at the dam, my hands trembling slightly as I held the wheel. Not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. Every vibration through the concrete beneath me reminded me that the valley itself was alive, and it demanded respect. Below, the HOA officers and the remaining workers were running in every direction. Some were trying to pull debris out of the water, while others screamed at terrified residents to move faster. Children clung to parents, crying, their tiny voices barely audible over the roar of the flood and the crackle of thunder. The chaos was absolute, and yet, within it, I noticed small acts of bravery. People were helping strangers, guiding them to safety, risking their own lives in a scene where panic and selfishness could have easily prevailed. The rain was relentless now, falling in heavy sheets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I could barely see the edges of the flood as it surged closer to the last row of homes. The water was fast, moving with the precision of a river that had waited decades for this chance to flow. The lessons of patience, respect, and empathy that had gone unheeded were being delivered in a language everyone could understand. Force. Then the first smaller extreme event of the chapter occurred. A partially built garage near the center of the neighborhood collapsed, sending a cloud of debris into the water. Sparks flew as metal twisted against metal, and wood splintered violently, carried downstream like kindling in a fire. People screamed and scattered, but a few courageous souls ran toward the danger, trying to pull others out before the flood could reach them. I watched as a young woman pulled a child from the path of the water just seconds before a floating beam struck the pavement where they had been standing. Even in the chaos, I reminded myself that my role wasn't to destroy, it was to guide. To ensure that the flood reminded them of what they had ignored without harming innocent lives unnecessarily. The water was powerful, yes, but with careful direction, it could teach without fully taking lives. I adjusted the wheel slightly, increasing the flow into the streets already weakened, ensuring that the floodwaters reached the homes but avoided the pockets where families were still clinging to safety. I could see Mr. Granger again, soaked to the bone, shouting orders that no one could hear. His confident, smug demeanor had completely disappeared. Now, he looked human, frightened, and powerless. He ran toward a house in the back row, trying to help a worker trapped on a porch as the floodwaters reached the steps. I noticed him glance up at me briefly, eyes wide. For the first time, I saw true fear. It wasn't just about the flood, it was about accountability, responsibility, and realizing that no amount of paperwork could shield him from the consequences of ignoring others. Then the next extreme event hit. A corner of the neighborhood's central road, weakened by the rushing water, finally gave way. Asphalt cracked and buckled, and the road collapsed into the torrent. Cars parked along the street were swept away, slamming into fences and houses downstream. People screamed as they ran for higher ground. The water surged faster, carrying debris with incredible force. The roar of the flood drowned out every other sound except for Willow's sharp barking and the occasional distant scream. Amidst the destruction, a small act of kindness stood out. The young worker I had watched from the beginning grabbed a child clinging to a floating piece of wood and handed them to a parent waiting on a safe patch of land. Then, without hesitation, he ran back toward the danger to help another person trapped near a collapsing house. In that moment, I realized that even in the worst disaster, courage and empathy survived. These acts reminded me that people could rise above fear, even when the world around them seemed determined to crush them. But the extreme event wasn't over yet. The farthest row of houses, still under construction and built on unstable ground, finally succumbed to the flood's pressure. Their foundations, soaked and weakened, crumbled, sending debris into the water like an avalanche. Wood, metal, and personal belongings were carried downstream, smashing into fences, cars, and smaller structures. The floodwaters rose further, and the valley itself seemed to shake, as if the earth was acknowledging the power it had held back for so long. I stayed at the dam, gripping the wheel tightly, knowing that the valley had transformed. The flood was no longer just water. It was a living reminder of what happens when arrogance, neglect, and greed are allowed to take precedence over kindness, patience, and empathy. Yet, amidst the chaos, there were flashes of humanity, courage, and connection that shone brighter than any fear or destruction. As the rain pounded harder, lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the chaos in stark, white bursts. I felt the power of the dam, the water, and the valley itself pressing against me. And I knew, deep down, that the next moment would bring an extreme event, even greater than any before one, that could change everything. The valley had become a battlefield between human recklessness and the patient power of nature. The floodwater roared through the streets, carrying debris from collapsed homes, broken fences, and shredded cars. The rain came down in sheets, drenching everyone and everything, turning the ground into slippery mud. Willow stayed by my side, her body pressed against my leg, growling and barking whenever debris or panicked residents came too close. I kept my hands on the dam's wheel, knowing the storm wasn't finished yet. The flood had claimed most of the lower rows of homes. Streets were unrecognizable, filled with swirling, brown water and floating wreckage. The first extreme events had already struck the valley. Houses had toppled, beams had fallen, and the road had collapsed under the weight of the water. But the upper sections, though partially spared, were now under serious threat. The rain had loosened soil on the hills above, and mudslides were creeping downward, carrying trees and rocks toward the neighborhood. I scanned the scene below. Mr. Granger and the remaining HOA officers were in disarray. He shouted orders that no one could hear, running through the chaos, trying to save workers and residents alike. For the first time, he seemed fully aware of what it meant to be powerless, of the consequences of arrogance. His expensive suit clung to him like a second skin, plastered with rain and mud. Yet, even in the fear, I could see him trying to help, trying to atone for mistakes he had ignored for years. Then, a smaller extreme event occurred. One of the houses in the far upper row, still under construction, began to lean dangerously. The wooden frame groaned, splitting under the pressure of rain-soaked beams. A worker nearby shouted, trying to stabilize it, but the wind was too strong, and the structure finally collapsed, sending a shower of splinters and debris into the floodwaters below. People scattered in panic, and the water carried some of the wreckage into already flooded areas. I adjusted the wheels slightly, letting more water out in a controlled surge. I wasn't acting out of vengeance. I was teaching a lesson. Nature had patience, but it had limits. I reminded myself of my father's words. Water is patient, but it always finds a way. This was the way. The floodwater surged faster now, moving toward the remaining homes with deliberate, unstoppable force. The residents reacted with fear and courage in equal measure. A young boy clung to a floating piece of furniture, and a worker dived into the current to pull him out. The boy's mother screamed, rushing to meet them. I saw Mr. Granger helping a terrified man climb onto a higher patch of ground, guiding him as the flood swept around them. These moments, amidst the destruction, reminded me that even in disaster, kindness could survive. People could rise to the occasion when pushed to the edge. But then the next extreme event struck. A large section of the upper hill gave way, sending a mudslide roaring down toward the neighborhood. Trees, rocks, and debris crashed into the flood below. adding to the already violent torrent. The ground trembled as the mudslide struck, and the water surged higher, sweeping more homes into its path. I could see beams and roof tiles from houses that had been barely standing now carried away like toys. The chaos was extreme, and the screams of residents echoed across the valley. I held the wheel tightly, guiding the water carefully. The dam was my responsibility, but it was also a tool to remind them of respect. The floodwaters were relentless, but I had control over just enough to ensure that lives could be saved. I could see the courage of people who acted quickly, neighbors pulling children from the water, workers carrying someone trapped onto safer ground. Each act of bravery balanced the fear, showing that even in disaster, empathy could shine. Then came a smaller yet tense moment. One of the partially built houses in the Mid-Valley Row, already weakened by the flood, began to lean. Its support beams cracked audibly. A worker tried to brace it, but the rain had made everything slippery and unstable. The house swayed dangerously, threatening anyone nearby. People shouted, trying to get everyone clear, while the water surged closer, adding pressure to the already unstable structure. And then the extreme event of the chapter arrived. The uppermost row of houses, built precariously close to the edge of the hillside, began to give way all at once. The foundations collapsed, and the homes tumbled down toward the floodwaters. Wood, metal, and furniture joined the torrent, striking other structures in its path. The water rose even higher, rushing faster, carrying debris downstream like a brutal river of destruction. The valley shook under the power of the collapse, and the chaos below became almost impossible to follow. I stayed at the dam, gripping the wheel, my muscles burning from tension. The water had grown into a living force, unstoppable, teaching lessons that no one could ignore. But amidst all the destruction, the small acts of courage and empathy, people helping each other, protecting children, saving strangers, stood out. The flood was not just a punishment, it was a mirror, showing them the consequences of ignoring kindness and respect. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it was worse now, hammering down in thick sheets that stung my face and blurred the valley below. The floodwaters had transformed from a river into a violent torrent, consuming streets, lawns, and the last standing structures in the neighborhood. Willow stayed at my side, shivering but alert, her low growls a reminder that even animals could sense the power and danger of the storm. I gripped the wheel of the dam tighter than ever, feeling the tremors through the concrete. The water was relentless, and the valley was paying the price for years of neglect and arrogance. The lower rows of homes were gone. The flood had claimed them entirely, their ruins swept downstream. The second and third rows were in chaos. Collapsing walls, floating debris, and submerged vehicles created obstacles that no one could navigate safely. The noise was deafening. The roar of the water, the snapping of wood, the screams of frightened residents. Even in the midst of the storm, I could see acts of courage, neighbors pulling each other to safety, workers diving into the rushing water to save children, and a few HOA officers finally realizing their mistakes and helping without hesitation. A smaller extreme event occurred early in the chapter. A construction crane, left unstable by the rain and mud, toppled partially, its arms swinging dangerously. It scraped the roof of a nearby house, sending splinters flying into the water. People ran screaming, trying to avoid it, while others froze, unsure of where to go. A worker grabbed a child from the flood and dove to safety just seconds before the crane's arm hit the street. I tightened my jaw, gripping the wheel, knowing that every act of care was now crucial to survival. Mr. Granger appeared again, soaked and panicked. He was yelling at people, trying to coordinate some semblance of safety, but the flood ignored every command. His expensive suit was ruined, plastered to his body, and his confidence had completely evaporated. The arrogance that had ruled him for so long was gone, replaced by genuine fear and desperation. I could see him helping a mother carry her child to a patch of higher ground. He was finally beginning to understand what it meant to be powerless in the face of a force greater than himself. The floodwaters surged, and I adjusted the dam's wheel again. Not recklessly, not with anger, but deliberately. I wanted to teach them, not destroy. This was nature's lesson, amplified by human arrogance, but tempered by my restraint. I watched as the water moved down the valley, picking up debris, breaking fences, and hitting the remaining standing homes. People screamed, scattered, and ran for safety. Courage and panic danced together in every street. Then the second extreme event hit. One of the upper hillside homes, already leaning from unstable construction, finally collapsed. Its foundation gave way, and the house toppled into the torrent below. The sound of wood and metal splintering, combined with the roar of the water, was deafening. Debris struck other partially destroyed homes and cars, creating a chain reaction that sent more structures tumbling. The flood rose higher, faster, and more violent than ever before. I felt the tremor of the collapsing house reverberate through the dam beneath me. Even amidst the destruction, I saw humanity fighting back. A young worker I had noticed from the start grabbed a floating child and passed them to a parent on safer ground. Neighbors pulled each other from the torrent, carrying the injured to patches of grass above the rising water. The storm and flood were merciless, but courage and empathy endured. It was a reminder that even in chaos, human kindness could survive. A smaller, tense event followed. One of the partially constructed homes in the Mid-Valley Row started to lean as the water undermined its foundation. A worker tried to brace it, slipping in the mud, narrowly avoiding being swept into the flood. People screamed, helping where they could, but the water pressed harder, relentless and unforgiving. I adjusted the wheel again, letting the water flow slightly faster toward empty streets, carefully guiding it to avoid the families still clinging to safety. Then the ultimate extreme event of the chapter occurred. The remaining row of upper houses, perched precariously on a rain-soaked hillside, began to collapse all at once. Foundations failed, and multiple structures tumbled into the floodwaters simultaneously. Wood, metal, furniture, and debris surged downstream like a raging river of destruction. The roar of the water drowned every other sound. The valley shook under the combined power of the collapse and the flood, and the chaos below became almost incomprehensible. I held the wheel, muscles burning, heart pounding, realizing that the valley had been transformed entirely. The floodwaters were now a living force, unstoppable, delivering a lesson that could not be ignored. Arrogance and neglect had led to destruction, but bravery, kindness, and empathy had survived, shining through even in the darkest moments. The storm, the flood, and the collapse were extreme, but they revealed both the worst and the best in people. Lightning cracked across the sky, and the thunder rolled immediately after, shaking the dam beneath me. I felt the tension of the moment, knowing that the final chapter, the resolution of the flood, the consequences, and the final lessons was coming. The storm had reached its peak. The rain fell in thick sheets, blinding anyone who dared to look up, and the floodwaters had become a full, violent river, tearing through the valley. Willow stayed glued to my side, her fur slick and drenched, growling at every debris-laden wave that passed too close. I held the dam wheel with a grip that burned my palms, feeling the tremors of the concrete beneath me. The water had become a living, unstoppable force, carrying the consequences of years of neglect, arrogance, and greed down the valley. The lower rows of homes were gone. The streets were nothing more than swirling, brown torrents of mud and debris. Cars were submerged or smashed against fences and trees. The second and third rows were partially destroyed, their foundations undermined, their walls buckled and splintered. People ran for higher ground, slipping in the mud, carrying children, or helping neighbors to safety. Every moment was a mix of terror and courage. Even in the chaos, acts of kindness persisted. Strangers pulled each other out of the water, handed children to safety, and held the weak while the storm raged around them. A smaller extreme event occurred early in the chapter. A large tree, loosened by the rain and saturated soil, finally toppled into the flood. Its massive roots tore through the mud, sending debris into the torrent below. Residents screamed, and cars were crushed or carried along by the surge. One man leapt from a truck just seconds before it was swept downstream. The young worker I had been watching from the start dove into the water to save a woman clinging to a fence. He handed her to higher ground and ran back for another, never hesitating despite the danger. I felt a pang of pride for him. Even in disaster, human courage persisted. Mr. Granger was nearby, soaked to the bone, shouting incoherently. His once pristine suit was ruined, plastered to his body with mud and rain. His confident demeanor was completely gone, replaced by fear and desperation. For the first time, he fully understood the consequences of ignoring warnings, of dismissing requests for empathy, patience, and respect. He helped where he could, lifting debris, pulling people out of the flood, and finally understanding that no board meeting or contract could protect him from nature's wrath. I adjusted the wheel slightly, releasing more water in a controlled surge. I was not acting out of vengeance, but to guide the flood in a way that would teach the final lesson without harming the families who had acted bravely and wisely. The water surged faster, hitting the remaining structures with relentless force. but the areas where people clung to safety remained just out of reach of destruction. Then the next extreme event struck. One of the upper hillside homes, perched precariously above the last row of streets, began to crumble. Its frame buckled under the combination of wind, rain, and the rising mud beneath it. A loud crack reverberated through the valley, followed by a deafening crash as the house toppled into the flood below. The debris struck partially destroyed homes and vehicles downstream, sending splinters, beams, and roof tiles flying. The water surged even higher, churning with destruction and raw power. The chaos was complete, and the valley itself seemed to tremble under the force of the storm and flood combined. Amidst this, acts of human bravery continued to shine. A worker helped a terrified child climb onto a floating piece of debris, while a neighbor reached through the water to pull a drowning dog from the current. People were saving what they could, caring for one another, and showing courage in ways the storm could not erase. Even Mr. Granger assisted a young couple to higher ground, his face streaked with mud, his fear palpable but overcome by the instinct to help. And then came the final extreme event. The last row of homes, those that had somehow remained standing until now, could not withstand the combined fury of rain, mud, and flood. Their foundations, soaked and unstable, gave way simultaneously. Houses toppled into the torrent, sending everything down into the now raging river. Debris collided with other structures, cars, and fences, amplifying the destruction. The valley shook as if the earth itself was responding to the reckoning. The roar of the water drowned out every other sound, leaving only the chaos of survival and destruction. I stood at the dam, gripping the wheel, muscles burning, heart pounding, and realized that the valley had been transformed. Arrogance and neglect had led to destruction, but courage, empathy, and kindness had endured. The young worker, neighbors, and even Mr. Granger had shown that humanity could rise even in the worst circumstances. The flood had been extreme, but it had also been a mirror, reflecting the cost of ignoring kindness and the resilience of those who choose empathy. Finally, as the rain began to ease and the floodwaters started to recede slightly, I allowed myself to breathe. The lesson had been delivered. The valley was scarred, but its people had survived, and some had even grown stronger, wiser, and kinder. I looked over the destruction, Willow at my side, and felt the weight of the moment settle. This was the end, but also the beginning of something new. Where are you watching from?